And this is something we've covered, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, although we certainly didn't cover it in the thoroughness that it warrants, because basically we're talking about getting to the bottom of the greatest catastrophe, not only to engulf this planet since we humans have been here, but the greatest catastrophe of the last 5 million years. And I believe that this catastrophe holds the secret to holds the key to understanding a whole lot of things in other distantly related fields of history and prehistory and human development and mythology and ancient architecture, occult traditions, and so forth. That the recognition that there are these thresholds that get breached, and once that threshold is breached for a short period of time, chaos reigns supreme, and at the end of this episode, things begin to settle out. But at that point, you have a new balance of nature, a new order of nature, or as it says on the Great Seal, a new order of the ages commences in the wake of these catastrophes. And of course, one reason why I believe that understanding the mechanics of these catastrophes is so important is that everything I have looked at in the last 25 years about the nature of and pace of change suggests the same conclusion over and over and over again, is that we have had and enjoyed an unprecedentedly long period without a major catastrophe. In fact, probably the longest period without a major catastrophe, at least within the last million years. Certainly, when we look at the reconstruction of climate that goes back over 250,000 years, 250,000 years, and which is the length of time that our ice cores reveal to us. The ice core is taken from Antarctica, the ice core is taken from Greenland. By means of these ice cores, we can reconstruct a fairly accurate climate proxy that can go back 250,000 years. Now, the significance of that 250,000 year period seems to be that as the age of modern humans is getting pushed back constantly all the time, 5 to 10 years ago, the oldest modern human was dated at 120 to 150,000 years. In the last 5 to 10 years, there have been several specimens of what appear to be completely modern humans that are over 180,000 years old. Now, if you have a modern human that's 180,000 years old, how much longer, how much previous to that 180,000 years were there modern humans? I'm going to guess that before we're through, we're going to push the age of modern humans on Earth back at least 250,000 years. If we do that, we're now essentially back. That's the age of the core of the Greenland ice cap. 250,000 years ago, something happened and ice began to accumulate on Greenland. So the 2-mile thick layer of ice that covers Greenland goes back, when you core down through the middle of it, you're coring back 250,000 years. In that 250,000 years, since those ice cores were extracted in the early 1990s, the scientists, the glaciologists, the scientists that study pollen and spores, the scientists that study the gases that are entrapped in the ice, the scientists that study the dust that's accumulated from volcanoes, from windstorms, from outer space, etc. All of these guys have been working on studying these ice cores for 15 years now. Okay, what are they coming up with? Well, one of the things that they've come up with that is of extreme relevance for modern human beings is that there has been no time within the last 250,000 years where we have gone over 6,000 or 8,000 years without a major climate change equivalent to the kind of climate change that drives the planet from an interglacial period into a glacial period and back again. We've been in one of those episodes for over 9,000, going on 10,000 years now. In other words, we've exceeded the record of stable climate by at least 2,000 or 3,000 years out of the last 250,000 years. When we look at the Holocene of the last 10,000 years, we take the scale of climate change, we compress it down to the 10,000 year period, and what we see that out of the last 10,000 years is there has been no period of climate change of stable climate longer than the one we're enjoying right now. So in other words, within the 10,000 years of the Holocene, you have no period of stable climate more than 300 or 400 years long where there hasn't been a major shift in climate of perhaps up to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees centigrade. We have gone now for about that length of time without a major shift. In fact, we can go back to the major shift that essentially plummeted the world into the Dark Ages of 536 to 540 AD. This ties it back in with the Holy Grail stuff we were talking about for the last few weeks, because one of the major components of the Holy Grail mythos has to do with this major shift that transforms this, transform, we call it Logris or Logres, which was the ancient name for England, into the wasteland. And involves the secret of how the curse of the wasteland can be lifted and, you know, the land's brought back to life. That was the essential secret of the Holy Grail. And we find that the setting of the Holy Grail, by coincidence, turns out to be exactly within the 5-year period that this major global climate change took place, between 536 and 540 AD, which is historically, even before the climate change was recognized, 536 to 540 AD was recognized historically as being the onset of the Ice Age, of the Dark Age. It's only within the last decade or so that the climate scientists and the dendrochronologists have put 2 and 2 together and realized, well, you know what, the Dark Ages wasn't just a metaphor, it really did get dark. And they go back to the annals of the Irish monks and the annals of these various peoples, and what are they talking about? They're saying that there would be months that would go by where they would not see the sun. Months that would go by. So we've always assumed that the Dark Ages was merely a metaphor, but it turns out that there actually was a Dark Age, and it precipitated a major global cooling and a collapse of societies around the world. Well, if we go back through the human record, what we find is over and over again the same story. Human societies seem to reach a certain level of development, and they become so oriented towards a specific set of conditions that when those environmental conditions change, society, if it can't adapt along with those changes, the society, just like the species, goes extinct. And in fact, this is now becoming the prevailing model in the study of the sociological history of the human species on Earth, is that we create these societies, the societies become entrenched into a certain balance of nature, then something from outside causes the balance of nature to change, and if human societies can adapt, they go on, if not, they disappear. And now it seems like many of the major human civilizations have gone that fate. Is that what is going to befall us? That's where it comes back, and why I think it's so goddamn important for us to come to terms with all of this stuff, because modern science is completely confirming what ancient traditions have suggested all along in their stories of great floods and fires from space and apocalyptic disasters. This wasn't stuff that was made up and conjured out of some illiterate, barbaric, uneducated mind. No, these are the tales of what our ancestors on this planet actually experienced and were able to survive, proven by the fact that we're here, and were transmitted down through the generations and through the centuries and through the ages to serve as a warning for those who would come later, who would at some point be taking things for granted when things were actually ready to shift gears. My question is when is the next gear shifting going to take place? Is it going to happen in 2012? Some people believe it. I don't necessarily believe that that marks the date of any particular catastrophe. In fact, if somebody said, what are the odds, how would you place the odds? I'd say, well, the odds are 100% in the next millennium, and they're probably 50% for the next century. But what that means is that they could be 50% in the next century, or they could be 50% in the next 2 or 3 years. See, that's the problem. I mean, we may have 50 years to prepare, but we may not. We may have 100. We may have several centuries to prepare, but we may not. Because we have already exceeded. The modern period of stable climate has already exceeded, by whatever measure, by whatever yardstick you choose to use, the modern period of stable climate has exceeded any known precedent, at least since during the time that we humans have been around. So, is that something that political leaders should be talking about? You think? Is that something that should be more on the radar screen? Is that something that should be taught in school? Hey, you know this myth about the Great Flood, this story about Atlantis? Hey, it might be true. It might be possible to factually demonstrate the reality of these stories. Well, if that's the case, do we shrug our shoulders and go on, or do we say this is something that has to be factored into our zeitgeist, into our worldview, and affect our worldview from this point on? I, of course, would hope that it would be the latter, because I believe that once we become more aware or more cognizant of our own impending mortality, you know, it's like business philosophers used to write about in the 70s and 80s was the Titanic effect. And they say the more that the business is prepared for a catastrophe, the better it's going to be able to either to prevent that catastrophe or to weather that catastrophe once it happens. That was known as the Titanic effect. Well, I think we might need to come to a Titanic effect as far as the planetary consciousness is concerned, and realize that we humans are actually all in the same boat. And that is that we are totally vulnerable at this moment to forces from outside our system that could at any time shift gears and completely change the whole equation. And we are constantly being given little flicks, little nudges saying, hey, look what happens when even a micro event happens. A hurricane is a micro event when we start talking about the kinds of things that that brought the world out of the last ice age and caused this mass extinction. Compared to that, a hurricane, the most devastating hurricane in modern times, is a micro event, a mini event. Because it's very probable that there were hypercanes in that climatary transition out of the ice age. And you know what a hypercane is? A hypercane is a hurricane that may be over 1,000 miles in diameter with winds up to 600 miles an hour. And these things have been modeled. And in fact, once the hypercanes were shown to be a very real possibility and triggered by the two most likely triggers for a hypercane was, one, a tremendous undersea volcanic eruption, and two, an asteroid or a comet impact into the ocean. And you know, when an object from space comes in, when our planet meets an object from space, that object is carrying unbelievable amounts of energy. And let me put it in perspective. In the early 1960s, Soviet Union, America, in this Cold War standoff, this nuclear standoff, right? We're testing nuclear weapons. The Soviets are testing nuclear weapons. We've gone from a little pop gun explosion, which took out the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 10 or 15 kilotons of highly purified chemical explosive, TNT, up to a megaton, meaning 1 million tons, up to several dozen megatons. The Soviets blew off in 1962, they tested a hydrogen bomb that's estimated to have been between 50 and 60 megatons. This is about double the explosion that wiped out 2,000 square kilometers, 700 square miles of Siberia back in 1908, 100 years ago. At the peak of the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet nuclear arsenals total together were about 10,000 megatons. 10,000 megatons. Do you have any idea how much energy it would take to melt the entire ice cap of the last ice age? Let me tell you this, you couldn't do it with the entire nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union and the United States at the early 60s, at the peak of the Cold War. When our arsenal's total megatonnage, global megatonnage now is about half of that, about 5,000 megatons. And though, you know, India and Pakistan have joined the nuclear club, Israel has, England has, but back in the early 1960s, it was the Soviet Union and the Americans, and together they had about 10,000 megatons, which was estimated to be able to wipe out the world completely 100 times over if it was distributed uniformly around the planet. Do you have any idea how much energy it would take to melt the ice complex? Well, I will tell you this, the entire nuclear arsenals of 10,000 megatons wouldn't even come close. It wouldn't even come close. In fact, one one Missoula flood would be perhaps 100 times more energy release than the entire nuclear arsenal. Perhaps 100,000 megatons would be the range of one Missoula flood flow. One Missoula flood flow. Now we're talking about we have to multiply that by somewhere between 10 to the second and 10 to the third to try to explain how we get rid of all of this ice. It'd be like, how would we, if your challenge was, get rid of the ice cap over the South Pole, how would you do it? Well, we could take our entire nuclear arsenal, unleash it at the South Pole, and it wouldn't do it. It would cause some pretty amazing weather. It would cause some pretty amazing melting events that would translate into many changes in climate and oceans, but it wouldn't melt the ice cap. The ice cap would freeze right back and be right back where it was a couple of years later. Even if we melted, several thousand cubic miles of ice with our nuclear arsenal, and that would be realistic. But bear in mind, there's 6 million cubic miles of ice there, and during the end of the last ice age, there was 10 million cubic miles of ice. And somewhere overnight, in a geological sense, all that ice disappeared. Boom, it was gone. And nobody's been able to explain where in the hell did the energy come from to do that. But we do know that at the same time that happened, the top of the food chain was decapitated. We also know that the Paleolithic age, what we call the Old Stone Age, came to a sudden end, and there was a hiatus in the archaeological record to be replaced 3,000 years later by the Neolithic. Archaeologists have recognized that for 100 years, this hiatus between the Old Stone Age and the New Stone Age. And it turns out that hiatus exactly brackets this 12,000 year ago event. And we don't know what happened. Nobody has a clue. Nobody has a clue, really, until within the last year or two. Then some major clues showed up. And what were those clues? Paul, you know, right?
Well, actually, I want to get away from the clues.
What were they?
No, I have a question.
Okay.
Do you have a theory for this in your mind and how you do it?
I don't have a fully mature, I am questioning. And because I don't have because here's the thing, Paul, I think that I'm getting close to it, and then I realize I look a little deeper, and it becomes even weirder than I thought it was.
Yeah, but you must have a theory that says, okay, there was an impact, and then I started melting, and then something happened to make it freeze again, and then in the meantime, something happened to kill the animals, but also to freeze them fast enough, like that one where the food was, and that was sitting. All these things together. Somewhere in your mind, there must be a working theory that you're working with for yourself that you're questioning. Can you share that?
Well, that's actually one of the objectives of, heading out to Montana in 2 weeks, is to continue to try to get to the bottom of it. Because, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know. In fact, I'm convinced now that having studied it for 30 years and having read all the literature, talked to a couple of dozen geologists and people who are working on it, is that nobody knows. And I might hold myself up and say, look, I have a theory that I think fits the evidence. But then again, I learn more, and then I see that there are things that even the theory of an impact from space can't explain. When I begin looking at this event, and the more I learn about the specifics of this particular event, the loss of animals, the change of the climate, the geomorphic changes, the suddenness with which it happened, the feedback mechanisms that somehow got completely rendered non-operational through this process. And there's a lot more I could say about it, and I have not gotten into that level of detail. I'm trying to explain it as a result of the consequence of a purely natural process.
Well, it was a great benefit that this happened 12,000 years ago.
Instead of 12 years ago, you mean? Or?
No, meaning that we were able to survive, not being eaten by these large animals. But, for you talking about how all these ice caps melted and everything and the energy involved, how could humans survive?
Well, see, there we get into, to me, one of the real mysteries is that how did humans survive? That to me becomes the central mystery. Because, I mean, as you can see, I mean, 20 million woolly mammoths, it's estimated worldwide. At least 20 million worldwide. Didn't make it. We're talking about North America, South America, Siberia, Eurasia, you know, nowhere. I mean, they inhabited most of the unglaciated land mass of the northern hemisphere, and they didn't survive anywhere. Yeah, I mean, that you just, to me, raised one of the central mysteries is really, how did we survive? Yeah, we'll get into this soon. I just have to assemble the stuff coherently. I haven't, but it's there. I've got and this could provide one of the central keys to the mystery. Well, let's think through this logically. Let's assume modern humans, and by modern humans, the main implication is that we're talking about people as intelligent as we are today. That there's at least, I mean, in spite of the fact that there's a lot of idiots, but there are some smart people out there, okay? We were able to get from basically a feudalistic society to putting a man on the moon in 2.5 centuries. 2.5 centuries. Now, if you go back 200,000 years of modern humans, how many spans of 250 years would there be in that? Well, 1,000 of them. I mean, how do we know what could have happened in any interval of 10 generations? Right? See, the assumption is you got to look at first, we've always got to get through this obstacle of conventional thinking. Conventional thinking is this model of a caveman, people living in caves. Where did that come from? Well, it came from the idea that when we saw all this cave art, they assumed, well, people were living in caves. People were certainly living in caves, but I would suggest it wasn't by choice. I would suggest that caves are probably just the same for people as they are animals. Under certain kinds of circumstances, they provide a place of refuge. And if you're waiting for a certain, you know, hey, in the 60s we built bomb shelters, right? And in the event of a war, everybody was going to go into their bomb shelter and survive for a while. Well, what do you do to amuse yourself while you're waiting for things to blow over, right? Right. Draw pictures on the wall, right? Exactly.
I saw a History Channel thing. There's a whole cities built underground someplace over in Europe, and they did a whole program on it. Whole cities built underground that have been evacuated for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that could certainly support the idea that humans from time to time have had to take refuge from in some place or another and survive in order to survive something. So, admitting from our own historical experience that we can go from essentially a global population of farmers, essentially, nomads, farmers, subsistence societies, and so forth, to putting a man on the moon in 2.5 centuries. How can we rule out the possibility that there wasn't some equivalent period of human intellectual development throughout the long span of time that humans have been here? And if we acknowledge the degree of severity to which the planet has changed in times past, we can certainly recognize that, well, if the planet changed as much in the next 10,000 years, or 15,000 or 20,000 years, as it did in the last 10 or 20,000 years, what would remain to tell future generations about our presence here?
There wouldn't be nothing here.
There wouldn't be anything here except for, you know, things like the Great Pyramid, which, of course, we look at the Great Pyramid and nobody's got a clue. They can come up with all the explanations they want. Nobody's really got a clue. And you have Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore would still be here unless, of course, it was in the direct line of an impact. And then, of course, with the new theories emerging from Herbert Shaw and others, it does appear that impact locations on Earth are non-random, but that's another important thing we need to explore, because it may very well be possible that in the event of a cosmic encounter, there are certain places on Earth that are more vulnerable and certain places that are less vulnerable. And that's an extremely important subject, the non-randomness of the geographical location of impacts as well as the non-randomness in time. But let's assume that people as smart as ourselves have been around for 150 or 2,000 years. What would we do if confronted with the foreknowledge that there was going to be a major global event that could perhaps wipe out 90% of the human population?
Massive anarchy.
What would we do? Well, let's say this. Okay, right now we've got scientific and political and military elites that have access to technologies that we mere mortals don't usually have. Let's say, for example, NASA sees something out there. Not just a single thing. Let's say it sees a cosmic entourage headed our way. And it'll be coming around our part of the cosmic neighborhood, let's say in 2 to 5 years. What would we do? Do we inform people? Do we tell the population at large? Or do certain, I'll call them elites, do they decide that they're going to do something to ensure or to maximize the probabilities of their survival? I would think that would be a very likely scenario. Well, they have done that. Certainly we can see that they did that in response to the possibility of a nuclear war, of a global nuclear war, went to great lengths to ensure that there could be the survival of an elite. But what if instead of a human-induced catastrophe, we're talking about a nature-induced catastrophe? What would we do?